So, having done like thousands of interviews at this point over the last 15 years of working with students and hiring hundreds of them, I think that the number one thing that students always say when they're applying for jobs with my firm is that they want to work in private equity. And I would say probably 75% of the time they actually don't know what that actually means. But they think you can make a lot of money in private equity, and it sounds sexy and it sounds like you're working in business. And so, why not raise your hand and say that's what you want to do? And the more you peel back the layer, the more you realize that they don't really know what private equity is. And so my hope is that today we can cover some of the things that you should include in your resume and really highlight to convince a private equity investor that's potentially going to hire you that you actually do know what you're talking about when it comes to private equity, and that you do actually really want to work in private equity. So the first thing we have to understand is what is private equity? If you want to apply for it, you got to understand what it really is. And ultimately, private equity is all about this, at least the way that it's referred to in the broader sense of leverage buyout private equity, is that you have these funds and they go out and they convince investors to commit capital to them. They then take that money and they go and identify businesses that are profitable. And they buy those businesses with a combination of debt and equity from their fund, from their investors. And then just like if you were to buy a piece of real estate and rent it out, and you would use some of your own money as equity and then the rest as debt, and then use the rents to pay off the debt, private equity investors are doing the same thing with companies. They buy these companies with a combination of debt and equity, and then they use the profits from the business to pay down the debt. And then by the time they're done, they could sell it off to another private equity fund. Profits may not have changed at all. Revenue may not have changed at all. None of those things. And they can generate a great return because maybe you put in 30% equity and you borrow 70% in debt. And then over the course of 5 years, you pay off all the debt and then you sell it and you make a little over 3 times your investment without having to do a whole lot of work. That's what private equity is all about. Now, there are ways to move some levers there so you can even juice your returns more. For example, you could go in and improve the overall operations of the business, for example. Understanding that's important because it should give you an indication of the types of things that you need to highlight on your resume and how to do that. So the first one is private equity investors are going to look for people that are really smart. The reason for that is because there are a limited number of jobs in private equity. And frankly, the financial modeling and skill set required to invest other people's money requires you to be fairly intelligent. And so you need to be able to demonstrate to potential hirers that you are one of those smart people. How do you do that? Well, if you have good grades, those should be at the top. If you've done well on standardized exams, those should be at the top. So I'm talking like GMAT, GRE, LSAT, ACT, SAT. If you're in the top 10, top 5% of test takers for those tests, put your score on there. It's helpful. You should be highlighting that you were on the dean's list, that you received different scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. Be able to demonstrate that you can get up the learning curve very quickly and that you are, smart, detail-oriented, hard worker, et cetera. The other way that you demonstrate that you are smart is by having internships that are competitive and hard to get. Those will oftentimes signal that you're very smart. And then the other thing that you can also put in there that can be helpful is anything that signals to them that other people have indicated that you are intelligent. So that could be like a professor that decides to hire you on as a research assistant or a teacher's assistant. Those can be really powerful signals that you are somebody that's trustworthy and smart. The next thing is, if you think about the work that's being done, there's a lot of financial modeling because private equity is really, at the end of the day, about financial engineering. And if you think through the process of getting a deal done, there's a lot of due diligence and analysis and modeling up front that needs to be done to decide, hey, if we want to pursue this deal or not. And so private equity teams will lean very heavily on their analysts and associates to help them build out and maintain those models. Because over time, as you move through the process, they'll identify the target, they'll do the analysis, they'll decide whether or not this is a deal that they really want to do based on their financial models and research. And if it is, then they'll have a bunch of diligence questions over time as they get those answers, that will impact the model. And so they need somebody that's kind of owning the model and updating it as they go. And then as they move through, like they're going to want to use debt and leverage on the investment. And so they'll have to bring in debt providers. Those debt providers will offer different deals in terms of, combinations of interest rates and warrants and, equity that they want to do, and et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that has to be put into the model and taken into consideration. And then, you've got to be able to model these companies because they have to be able to sustain the debt loads that are being put on them. The news is awash of stories where the private equity fund didn't accurately forecast where profits were going to be, and they didn't have enough money to pay down the debt, and the company ended up going bankruptcy. That can be incredibly damaging to a private equity firm. I mean, private equity firms really can't sustain very many losses, unlike a venture capital fund can. And so they have to be really good at the financial modeling. What all of this means is that if you're coming in as the analyst or associate, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have strong financial modeling skills, because you're going to be doing a lot of it. In fact, arguably, you're going to be doing more financial modeling in private equity by a long shot than you'll do in investment banking. And so having experiences, therefore, even if you're doing investment banking or have done investment banking, having experiences prior to that where you're actually working on live deals can be incredibly valuable, because you'll be able to demonstrate your financial modeling ability through those experiences, hopefully. If you haven't done those things, then sometimes taking financial modeling courses can be really helpful, and being able to put different certificates that you've received, et cetera, can be meaningful on your resume. Maybe also, talking about favorite books that are related to private equity that you've read and you think are like some of your favorite books. Those kinds of things can be interesting. The other thing too is that the other opportunity that's oftentimes available to work in private equity, especially as like an entry-level position, is not actually that finance driven. You do need to understand like basic finance, and you do need to understand like how private equity funds make money and how to assess like from a high level a deal. But a lot of opportunities come where you're in more of a sourcing role. And so being able to highlight a combination of like sales and relationship building and like grit to get up and call companies day in, day out and figure out how to get in with the company and convince the CEO to give you some time, as a fresh, wet behind the ears new analyst, can also be, really impactful if you can marry it with like a passion and a knowledge around finance. Because a lot of those jobs are like, hey, we're going to take you, we're going to put you in the meat grinder of like almost like a smile and dial sales type position. But if you understand the finance side and you have the grit to survive in that, then you can really thrive. And if you're able to identify investment opportunities for the firm, it can pull you out of the deal sourcing engine and into the diligence engine, which is ultimately where you want to be, because that will get you on the career track to becoming more of a managing partner or managing director eventually someday. You also need to demonstrate that you're willing to work long hours. I think some of the ways that I've seen people do this effectively is like, they talk about internships that were really hard. They talk about, volunteer experiences. Maybe you worked for Greenpeace or something and worked in really harsh environments and worked really hard. Sometimes it's, you did investment banking and you survived through that, right? Being able to demonstrate though that like you work hard, you produce very high quality work, you have high attention to detail, through your experiences and through your accomplishments is ultimately another thing that will really kind of set you apart, and things that the private equity investors are looking for. Hopefully this video was helpful as you're trying to think about like what are the things that I should accentuate on my resume and how to do that. It's really about like, are you smart? Do you understand finance and private equity? Are you really truly passionate about it? And are you willing to work long hours and crank hard on these deals? And if you can demonstrate that through your experiences and accomplishments and really highlight that for the recruiter, then it will put you above a lot of those that are just kind of throwing in a vanilla resume to anybody. Hopefully this was helpful. Please check out my other video where I do an in-depth review of somebody's resume that had applied to our firm. I've scrubbed out all the personal details, but hopefully you'll learn some tips and tricks of things, and at a minimum, get a feel for how at least I think about resumes when I review them. Thanks for joining.